I think it gets very divisive when we get beyond. Well, it can be divisive within the historical community, of course, but when we get to historical landscapes, in the public sector itself, and the question of how a community remembers its own story, its own past, through monuments, through memorials, and that's quite often, at least what I found in writing this book, that quite often has to do with political power. Who's in the positions that influence what happens to our public spaces. And in the context of the Civil War, I think that is where you'll find the deepest divisions, at least in the last few decades.
I ran into a person who traveled as a boy frequently to Gettysburg, and he and his family stayed in a particular campground at Gettysburg. And then the National Park Service, as it is done in Gettysburg and the surrounding area, purchased that campsite and obliterated any vestiges of it, trying in their effort to bring Gettysburg back to 1863. Well, this upset this fellow immensely, because the Gettysburg he had known as a child was now gone. And it's interesting to take that perspective and to see that while he was a Civil War buff and he knew a lot about the Battle of Gettysburg, Gettysburg as a place also meant something personally to him, and this campground, he had a fondness for this and an association with Gettysburg itself, so that with it being gone, he was disoriented. An interesting little story, just a little anecdote that I thought spoke volumes about memory and Civil War and battlefields.
Well, I know there was a lot of people upset, including myself, when a certain college in Gettysburg took away part of the first day of the railroad cut, and that was something that was in our memory. In fact, I used to stay at the Doubleday Inn right above it. It's a plug, and it's right above that place where they extended their soccer field, and is part of memory, and you don't want to let that go.
Or even the recent dismantling of the old Gettysburg map in the old visitor center. When that went down, I mean, I blogged about it quite often at Civil War Memory, and I'll tell you, there were people who were just coming out of the woodwork to voice their very personal memories of what it was like, as a child to go to the Gettysburg Visitor Center, and that's what they remember in terms of how they were oriented to the battle itself. That was sort of their roadmap to the battle, and now it's gone.
I have that as well myself. When my parents took me down, if you're here in Illinois, your DNA is linked to Lincoln, and we went down to his home, and as beautiful as it is today, what they've made a wonderful park of 2 streets there that you can walk down and feel like you can transport yourself back very easily. But my parents drove up to the side of the house, and I got out and walked in, and I miss that today, the informal nature of just going to visit Mr. Lincoln.
Yeah. I visited very recently the Lincoln home site, but had not been since 1964 when I was a teenager, and noticed the very same differences, and was overjoyed with the restoration that the Park Service has done there, but a little saddened that my own orientation and remembrance of the house, which when I visited in 1964 was painted white, and now it's a tannish color or something. It throws you off. It throws you off. It throws the individual off, and that has to do with memory.
Why do you think that humans feel the need to construct a useful history for their own lives, actually?
Well, because they have to study it in school, and man, that's horrible. That's an awful experience for the majority of people. And so if it can be a useful history that explains something about their present, then people, some people, seem to get more of a satisfaction out of that. As, oh, well, that occurred, and now that's why we do this or we do that, or we're here or we're there. The problem with that, however, for historians is that's a double-edged sword of sorts, because from the other direction, it's a little too easy for historians to project the present back on the past, trying to make those connections. And when that happens, historians call that presentism. And it essentially commits the sin of anachronism. Is you're projecting your own present back onto the past just so that you can edify perhaps yourself as well as your readers that, oh, here's how the past is linked to the present, and it may not always be the case.
I think at a fundamental level, and this is one thing that I try to pull out of my students, especially teaching on a high school level, and I think we all understand this at some point, that our lives are not, that we don't exist as individuals in a vacuum, but at some level we understand that who we take ourselves to be, what we see around us, comes from somewhere. And we want to understand that. We want to understand how our lives relate to what came before. And I think if you can pull that out at a certain age, and for me, as a teacher, it's at that important age, that high school age, you can impress upon people the importance of understanding that broader story, that it enriches your own understanding of yourself and the broader community in which you live. So there's a moral element, I think, in this usable past. At least that's why I study history.
Now, in the crater, you think it inspired a uniquely interesting public memory, or would any Civil War battle be as interesting or controversial? Or was the crater different?
Well, I think the crater follows a broader narrative that historians have picked up on over the past number of years. I mean, here you have a story, a battle that, right at the center of it is this very strong, racial element. This is the first time that Robert E. Lee's army is facing off against an entire division of United States color troops. And, what I tried to understand is that, at least in the immediate wake of the battle, what these Confederate soldiers are saying about, what their presence meant to them, how that altered their view of what the war was about. That by, within a few decades, that element of the story had been pushed aside, not just in the South, but I think throughout much of the country. Some have argued, like Blight, that it's the pressures of reunion and reconciliation. It didn't fit what, at least what the people who were remembering the battle and memorializing the battle at the turn of the 20th century, what they needed. It didn't fit that story. In fact, it directly countered what they needed at that time. And so in that sense, the story follows, I think, a well-worn path. And in more recent years, it's come back because it is such a crucial element of the history itself. I mean, you can't make any sense of the battle without understanding, what their presence meant, on the battlefield, its significance. And, that's another example, getting back to the whole issue of divisiveness in our public landscapes. That's a struggle that the National Park Service has taken on in terms of reinterpreting the battlefield itself, and in Petersburg, which is predominantly African American. So, almost forgot the original question, but
I'm just going to ask this: do you think PC is part of the National Park Service?
These are. I think, I think these are catchwords that people are using when they want to say something else, but they perhaps don't know how to voice it. I think the National Park Service itself, has gone through various transitions. At least in terms of the crater, the Park Service took control in the 1930s. It had inherited a view of the battle that had been solidified by that point by white Virginians in the Petersburg area. It was a story about Mahone, the successful counterattack. It was a story of the bravery of these Confederate soldiers, the last major victory in the Petersburg campaign for the Army of Northern Virginia, and again, that part of it is, at least with the racial element, that part of it is not coming back into the public spotlight.
I don't think political correctness necessarily. I think you put it very well, Kevin. That people are trying to express something but don't know how to express it, and they call it political correctness. But in terms of the efforts over the last, I lose track, 5 years, decade or so, that the National Park Service has tried to reinterpret all the battlefields within the context of the causes of the Civil War, or the primary cause of the Civil War, which historians, Civil War historians at least, do have a consensus that the primary cause was slavery, well, then it would only make sense for the National Park Service to reflect that scholarly consensus and try to inject, where appropriate, the nature of the causes of the Civil War, or in the case of the Crater, that in fact you have African American participants in the battle itself, and the racial issues, though difficult, and we struggle with this in our nation to this very day, but to at least address those issues. I commend the Park Service for what it's attempted to do.
I think the political correctness comes in. I think it's another way of saying that I simply disagree with the interpretation itself.
Right.
And I think that brings up the generational element in Civil War memory. I think, we're at a point now where the Centennial crowd, the crowd that sort of matured during the early 1960s, the interpretation that perhaps they grew up with is now sort of being pushed to the sidelines. We're now talking about the home front. We're now talking about social history. We're talking about the tough issues of race and slavery. And, some people who go to battlefields simply do not want to hear those stories. And I think the political correctness is their way of voicing that without going into much detail.
Right.
Now, John Simon certainly felt that Lincoln was really trying to preserve Union. That was his primary reason for allowing war to come.
Yes.
And but Abner Doubleday, I saw a letter of his recently go up at auction, and he was saying, it was in the summer, or the late spring, summer, it must have been summer, of 61, and he's saying anyone who thinks that this is not about slavery is dead wrong.
Right.
See, and of course even Union, as John Simon is saying in one of his essays in your book, that even though it was Union, it was predicated on the slavery issue.
Yes.
Union, to stay with Union, stopped slavery from nationalizing itself.
So that even, and John argued this, that Lincoln would have agreed with Abner Doubleday at that point in time, in August 1861. However, everyone knew, and it's now easier somehow to find the evidence of that generation, the Civil War generation, saying, well, yeah, it's slavery. That's what really is going on here. And even Southerners acknowledging that it's to protect slavery. They called it protect our way of life, but it's a euphemism for protecting the slave society in which they lived.
There's also an issue, a moral issue, an ethical issue that was not addressed in the South as it was in the North, I suppose, and even the large amount of the North didn't care that much either until time went on a bit, and Lincoln, in his leadership, showed that it had to matter.
Yeah.
So that's also a part of the...
And the Emancipation Proclamation, and John Simon pointed this out, and does so particularly in one of the essays in this book. It's the Emancipation Proclamation that, in fact, raises to the forefront, pushes to the forefront that issue of slavery, and that this great war is being fought over that issue of slavery. But even at the same time, the Emancipation Proclamation changes the nature of the war, not only, as we often say, elevating the cause of the war to a higher plane, or the fighting of the war to a higher plane, but also in the fact that Lincoln very specifically issued the Emancipation Proclamation as a military measure, that is, a temporary measure, by which the Union would win the war, depriving Southerners of their property, very valuable property that was used to drive wagons, build fortifications, and so forth, that in depriving Confederates of their property, the North was gaining an advantage, a very definite advantage in winning the war.
And just like the Declaration of Independence didn't do a darn thing, they sought to fight that war.
That's right.
Same thing with this. It didn't end slavery, but I think Lincoln knew that this had to be one of the next nails in the coffin.
Well, and he knew too, and John argues this as well, that the 13th Amendment was vital to accompany or to be ratified as soon as possible after the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln was very worried, in fact concerned, that when the war ended, and if the Union won, which he expected it to do, that military measure would then become null and void. So the 13th Amendment was needed in order to change the interpretation of the Constitution that was put forth in the Dred Scott decision.